Hello there and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing room for the skirt of the Mandragora silk suit project. And I did again make a polyester mock-up of this skirt before diving into the silk, so you will see that skirt here as well, which coordinates but doesn't exactly match the jacket from last week. This will be a bit of an exaggeration on skirt styles. I've played with a little bit here before on the channel way back when. I'm not even going to link you to the video because I'm not super thrilled with how that project came out. But let's just say I played with a flare on a pencil skirt before, but today I'm going to take the flare all the way and make basically a half circle skirt slash pencil skirt, and you'll see exactly what I mean over on the blue patterning table of doom, as always. And we begin with a very large piece of alphanumeric paper and my pencil skirt basic block pattern. This is the basic block skirt pattern. You can see me draft this pattern here in this video. I will put up in a card for you here if you would like to draft your own pencil skirt pattern. And I will use mine as a base today for this skirt. And I'm going to go ahead and trace a full front of this. So I'm going to trace the front of this, including the center front here, and then I will mirror this along the center front. I will trace in my darts as well. So I'm just going to line this up along the center front and mirror that so I have a full front here. And I'm actually going to trace the back attached to this at the side seam as well. I don't want to have a side seam on the right hand side of my skirt today. This pattern already has seam allowance included, so I will draw that on here so I can see it and be able to line up my side here. I'm going to draw it onto my card version of my back as well. I don't normally do something like this, but for taffeta, I think having a side seam in a pencil skirt is a no. Like, the more fitted the skirt, the less you want a side seam. So in a circle skirt, no problem. In a large full skirt, no problem. But in this more fitted skirt, I want to eliminate this side seam. I'm going to do that by just using this little curve up here at the top of the side of my hip. I'm going to use that as if it is a dart, along with all the other darts we have going on here, so I can trace the back along the side seam of the front, like so. So I will not have a right hand side seam on this anymore. I'll just have that little dart at the top of the hip. That will be mostly covered by jackets if I'm wearing this with a jacket anyway, like I intend to do with this particular project. In fact, my paper is not long enough, so I'm going to have to cut more paper here because this is a full front and full back plus a little bit of a flare. There's only going to be one seam on this skirt, and that is going to be on the left hand side down the middle of the flare, so you'll see that here. But I'm taping on more paper here so I can trace the other side of the back. We saw how I mirrored the front. I'm going to mirror the back now, like so, lining this up along the center back, like so, and tracing the rest of this, and again marking in my darts because I will need those to make the skirt fit, like so. And now I'm going to draw in those darts, and then I'll start deciding how deep along the side I want to put my flare in. I was just trying to find a marker that had a fine tip still. I go through these Crayolas pretty fast in here because I press too hard. And of course, I always recommend using pencil, especially mechanical pencil, while doing pattern drafting. But of course, I'm doing it for camera, so I need you to be able to see my lines, and therefore I'm using marker. But for best accuracy, use pencil when doing pattern drafting. Unless you're doing it for camera, in which case Crayola washable markers work quite well. Although I do get ink all over my hands. So I'm going to come down 6 inches from the side of my hip here, on the left-hand side of my skirt eventually. And I'm going to not even come out a 90-degree angle. I'm going to tip it up a little bit. I'm going to come out maybe, I don't know, 100 degrees. And measure down from where that mark hits the hip to the hem and see how long that is. I think it was 24 inches for me here. And so I'm going to make this angled line 24 inches as well. Of course, I will need a tiny bit more paper for that, so I've just torn some off the hem. But this mark here, my ruler is 18 inches long, then I need 2 inches and then 4 more to get to that 24 inches long. And then I'm going to radiate that 24 inches from that mark all along this to kind of create a circle, well, not kind of create a circle flare, to create a circle flare from that area here. So I'm just coming out, I don't know, 10 inches at a time here so I can figure out where my hem needs to be and draw and sketch in that curved hem for this flared portion. I've added a little bit of flare this way before, like I've said, but today I was like, not only do I want to come out 90 degrees, I want to come out a little more than 90 degrees because I really want this to flare. Now, this would be easier to do this flared side and then do the zipper on the other side seam, but again, I already eliminated that other side seam. So in any other fabric, I probably would put the zipper in the center back or in the side seam, but in this taffeta today, I really want to have as few seams going on as possible. So I'm going to put my zipper in the top of this little curved area as well. So that's fun for me. You'll see how I end up doing that later. You can see I just sketched in that curved hem along that flared portion. And I have this giant pattern now. And I need to add the flare to this other side as well. I'm going to start cutting things out though so I can have this be a tiny bit more manageable because it's just kind of a nightmare. Again, those pencil skirt patterns, the block card versions, those are just poster board from the grocery store or Walgreens or the craft store. It's not anything special, it's just poster board. But those already have seam allowance, so I don't need to add seam allowance to anything. I just made sure I layered it closed here, and same for the center, front, and back. And I will cut this out a tiny bit, but I'm going to add flare to this other side as well. And the way I'm going to do that is just trace it from this side I already drew in, because of course, why draw this circle twice when we could just use this as a template for the other side? So you'll see me fold that in a minute. Still cutting off all this excess here. I will use all this paper. I keep a bin next to me where I just keep offcuts that I can use to draft collars, facings, or just anytime I need a little scrap of paper. And these are quite big scraps, so I will tape them onto this other side in order to trace that circle. Lots of tape and lots of paper here in my studio, of course. Although I think a normal person who doesn't, demonstrate sewing as their day job would go through a lot less paper and tape. But of course I'm here every week doing more patterns. I'm going to fold this along the other side seam that I closed up just to get an idea of where I need to be over here. And then I will, of course the back of my pattern is a little bit wider than the front of my pattern because the back of my body is a little bit wider than the front of my body. So I need to actually line this up side seam to side seam, but just getting a general idea of how much paper I'll need to tape on over here to trace this extension onto the other side seam as well. And you could, this pattern is technically reversible, like if you laid it down on the fabric, depending on how you laid it down on the fabric, you could have this flare be either on the right or on the left. Today I want it to be on the left hand side. For whatever reason I decided that. I guess because I carry things in my right hand and I have things going on using my right hand because I'm right-handed. So I like to keep fabric out of the way in some ways. But I'm just going to line up that side seam and trace in this semicircle that I added to the other one onto this side as well. So we can have basically a half circle or a little more than a half circle of fabric as flare on this side seam. So the rest of the pencil skirt stays the same shape as it ever is, but then this hopefully will hang in a nice side drape here without having to have any additional pieces seamed on, and we will see how that goes for me today. I'm going to cut that out like so, and you can see I have that sharp, a little over 90-degree angle where it meets that side. The way I ended up finishing these today, that worked out fine, but I do in the end smooth this off after I make a mock-up, so I'll show you that in a minute. Just wanted to make sure I had that correct, like so. I'll draw on the seam allowance so I know where this little dart needs to be. All right, the last thing I wanted to do here is turn these two darts on the side front, or the side of this front where the drape is, into tucks instead of darts. So I'm going to draw curved lines up into the side seam here, and then I will close these darts and open those up into pleats in the side, just so that it looks a little bit gathered and gives a little bit of a swag effect to my skirt as opposed to having darts on this side. You can always move darts around, as we know I like to do here on the channel. Also, my bangs today are sticking up at some serious angles, so wow. And you may notice that I have band-aids on my arm again, and that is because I didn't do my perfect due diligence with my skin. For those of you who've been following the saga of rescuing kittens and having them attack me in ways they did not intend. So I needed to keep putting my cream on for another week, and I didn't, and now I'm paying the price for that. So back to my band-aids. Love it. But I've just closed those darts, shifting that fullness into these tucks on the side, and I will fold those pleats upwards shut and then cut off the excess along the side seam here just to smooth that back out and have the correct shape for my pleats here. But I will go ahead and make a mock-up with this pattern, and I'll show you what that looks like here. So here is a apricot iridescent polyester taffeta from moodfabrics.com that I used to make the mock-up for this to coordinate but not match with the black bat jacket from last week. So I'll pair this with that black jacket for a fully Halloween look, but this is how this pattern looks once sewn together and with a waistband on it. And I will make a tiny bit of adjustments before I cut this out in the silk, and we will make the silk one together, and then I'll show you both of these skirts styled some more at the end. But I just wanted to smooth out this very sharp angle here, that way I could contain this in some bias tape later easier. So I went ahead on this one side and drew in a little bit of a curve here, just softening that angle where my side drape meets my side seam here, and just taping that down, taping down my floops, of course, and I will fold this in order to trace that curve for the other side so that it still matches up, of course. But I just decided to make my sewing process a tiny bit easier by making this be a curve instead of a direct angle into the side seam. Makes it a tiny bit easier. Again, best idea here would be to put the zipper in the other side, but I was just trying to avoid having a side seam on the other side, so I'm getting creative to try and avoid that situation. And by creative, I mean causing myself a little bit of anguish when it comes to sewing this. But that's all right. Minor anguish, always allowed here in the sewing room. But I have this giant full skirt piece, and of course, because this is just one large, huge piece, I need to cut out this on one single layer of the silk. So here I have it laid out in the other part of the basement here. So I can cut this out on one layer of silk, and then I cut it out of a layer of black muslin as well to interline this. This is the key to taffeta skirts. I've made a couple of taffeta skirts in the past, like not costuming skirts, because costuming I always interline, they always turn out just as I hope. But I didn't interline the last taffeta pencil skirt I made, and I really hated the way that that skirt draped and fell. In fact, it never even made it onto the channel. It was for a Patreon bonus video last Christmas, and I just hated the skirt. So I totally wasted the silk, and I felt terrible. So if that ever happens to you, every once in a while, it does still happen to me. I'm sorry to say, even if you've been sewing as long as I have and have a degree in fashion, sometimes you still make mistakes. Luckily, it's rare, but it does happen. So I made this purple taffeta skirt that did not work out last year, and the lesson I learned was, why do the costuming skirts come out so good? It's because they're interlined. This taffeta just needs a backing to drape with the kind of weight in any sort of, I don't know, skirt like this, for example. It just adds the right amount of extra floop to it all. And by floop, I don't mean like floopy as in fluid this time. I mean like, I guess, flomp. Like it needs some sort of a weight to it to fall into the curves correctly and to have, to keep its shape. It's got a crispness, but as soon as you move, it's just like almost too crispy. So it needs to have some stability going on, is what I'm trying to say. Interline your taffeta skirts. In both, I interlined both the polyester and the silk one today, and I think the interlining helped with both. So I've lined up my pieces here. I've pinned around the edges so that I have my taffeta and muslin as one piece. From now on, I'm going to treat them as one piece. I'm flatlining this with the muslin, and I will trace my darts onto the back of the muslin off the back of the skirt here. And I'm actually going to go ahead and baste, taking a little bit of cotton thread, running it through some beeswax here, putting it on a beading needle. We all know how I love a beading needle. And I'm going to baste the interior of these darts just to make sure these two layers don't come apart while I am sewing the darts in. Because of course I have many a dart to sew at the top of the skirt today, and I know from experience working on costuming with this silk and interlining it the same way here, that I can baste it quite easily here and it will stay together. I mean, the cotton has a certain, not like stickiness, but like a certain tactile friction that holds it to the silk pretty well. They become friends quite quickly, but of course you want to keep these things aligned when doing things like darts and seams, etc. So just quickly baste these together before I pinch and pin my darts and set this all next to the machine, ready to be sewn. Lots of darts today, but I'm no stranger to darts, as we know. And you can see I'm pinning the layers together at the points of the darts too while I have everything flat. Again, just trying to keep these two layers where they need to be while I sew all of this. But I will pin away and then take this all over to the machine shortly. And this side seam here, which is now this tiny little dart at the top, I'm just going to treat this as if it were a dart. I'm going to draw the point in here, just continuing the seam allowance until it reaches the side seam, or like where the side seam would be. And then I just sew this as if it were a dart, no different, just because it's cut off a little bit. Doesn't make any difference when it comes to, sewing from the large end off the tip, tying the tip shut. Same as I would sew any other dart, it just happens to be a side seam here. I'll try and curve off that tip a little bit, but same sort of process over here on the machine, starting at the large end of darts, using a 12 stitches per inch smaller stitch length here, which I use pretty standard on my machine, but especially for darts, you want to make sure you have a smaller stitch length. And then sew off the tip of the dart, and I tie my dart threads shut, just how I was taught to do it in fashion school, and I've done it that way ever since. They taught us several different methods, but that was my favorite, and it's always worked for me. But of course, there are many ways to sew a dart, and whichever way works best for you is the best way for you, as I always say. I'm not prescriptive about sewing methodology. I know a lot of people don't sew over pins, for example, but alas, I do. As we know. I mention it every time. It's part of the bingo of watching my channel, okay? Now I'm going to press my darts towards the center back and towards the center front, depending on which part of the skirt I'm working on here. I'm just pressing those over my tailor's ham here. Pressing that. This is a, silk and cotton, so I can use a relatively medium heat iron and a little bit of steam here. I think I use steam more often than you're supposed to, but I love it. Works so well, so whatever. And I just pressed that side seam, sort of dart seam, just to the back. I didn't even bother cutting it open and pressing it open and stuff like that. I just pressed it towards the back. Gonna be fine. And over here I have these tucks instead of darts, so I'm just going to mark where those need to be, these pleats here, with some pins, and then I will pleat these into shape as best I can with these, dual layer fabric going on here. I could have basted this area first, but I knew I could handle it. I had just made the other orange skirt, so I knew what I needed to do, and then I could make it happen. I actually used a little bit stiffer cotton to interline the orange version of this skirt, and between that and the fact that the polyester just has a little bit more, springy body to it, that one hangs actually even better than the silk one. So I might open up the hem of this silk skirt. You'll see me do the hem later, but I might open this up and put a little bit of horsehair braid in there just to make it floop a little bit better. We'll see how it goes in the end. I'm probably too lazy to ever do that, but that was what I would do to fix this in the end. You'll see the difference between the orange version and this green. Both are pretty, but the orange one, the drape just falls even better than this. So, odd that the polyester one turned out a little bit nicer than the silk, but that's all right. So here I'm lining up my one seam on this skirt, which is this flared, the seam along the circle flare, and then up into the top. I'm just going to sew about to the top of this flare, and then from 6 inches down up, I'm going to put in a zipper, so I'm going to leave that open. But for the bottom of this flare, I can sew this shut with 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can see there's a seam there I just sewed over. That is actually because I didn't have enough black muslin and I had to put one seam in the interlining, so I did that, pieced it together. Whatever, it had to be done. I thought somewhere in this sewing room, there are like 6 yards of black muslin waiting to become a costume interlining, and I don't know where I put it. And you'd think it would be hard to lose 6 yards of fabric, but apparently it's still possible because I have no idea where I put that muslin. Maybe I used it for something and I forget, but I had to order more black muslin for my upcoming costuming project here in October because I was like, where did it go? And I looked everywhere. Ugh. I found a couple of other things I couldn't find recently, but alas, not the muslin. And because there will be no additional lining to this skirt, I am going to go ahead and just quickly like whip stitch or sort of whip stitch / fell the seam allowance open and down to the inner lining. So I wasn't stitching through the whole skirt. I was just stitching through the black layer just to hold that down and keep it from fraying on the inside there. And then here I'm going to finish the rest of the opening of this seam with some double fold bias tape that I cut out of the silk. So this is the silk cut on the 45-degree angle, 2 inches wide, and then pressed into bias tape. If you've ever seen any of my costuming videos, you've seen me make silk bias tape before. Same idea. I'm just going to finish these edges up here before I put the zipper in, giving myself a little bit of a faced edge, like a really finished edge along where the zipper will be. You could even just put a placket in here and do snaps or hooks instead of doing a zipper, but I will just go ahead and throw a zipper in here in a minute. You'll see that. Just sewing that on, 1/2 inch seam allowance over here, and then I'll turn it to the inside and fell the inside down. So you'll see that momentarily. And this color of silk with the green lighting on it, always a favorite. All right, so I'm just going to clip the curves of this. I added that curve to where this flare meets the body of the skirt, so that this can be finished with bias tape simply, compared to when I was trying to do this on the sharp corner of the orange one. Less fun. I'll just turn this in so it's all finished on the inside, pin this into place, give it a good press, and I will fell down, again, the other edge of the bias tape just to the black interlining layer. And again, more perks of having an interlining, because it is still hanging a little bit loose from that silk layer. I can go ahead and just stitch all this down to just the black layer, and there will be no stitches that show on the front, but it will all be secure on the inside here. So here's what that looks like on both sides, felled down, smooth, ready to go. So that entire seam edge is now at least mostly finished. The top is bias encased, the bottom is slip stitched, or like felled down-ish at least, to avoid fraying. And then I have this little best color match I had in stock, sort of brown olive green zipper. I'm going to stitch the back side of the skirt right next to the zipper teeth here. I'm going to use the machine for that. And then the other side, I'm going to do a lapped zipper. I will overlap the other side, and I will hand stitch that down, which I really need to get footage of doing that, but it's just, you know, taking prick stitches and sewing it by hand instead of sewing by machine. You know, hand sewing sometimes gives you a little bit more control when you're dealing with something this large, and irritating over here on the machine is kind of bothersome. I don't know how quilters do it. I guess they have those like free arm quilting machines where there's a little bit more room to move around, but when working with a giant project over on the machine, it's not always the most fun. But I'm just stitching that down using my zipper foot to get right next to the zipper teeth. For this one side, I'll move the zipper pull and sew the rest of this down like so. And then over here, I'm just going to pin this other side so that it just overlaps. And then I will hand stitch where I'm putting these pins here. Basically, I'm just going to put a little prick stitch, prick back stitch, I guess, to hold this other side down. And once that zipper is in, I can start working on my waistband to finish the top of this skirt. So I'm just going to interface a 3-inch wide strip of my fabric cut on the grain here. You can see that I've got this cut like lengthwise against the lengthwise grain. So just making sure that my fusible interfacing is stuck down to the silk here. Instead of interlining this, I just interfaced it. I'm going to find the center of this piece. This piece is like 4 or 5 inches longer than my waist. My waist is like 30.5 inches. So I'm just going to mark the middle and then either side, basically, of my waist measurement on this. Like so. And then, of course, I have a little bit of extra each side, so I can make a little tab for a skirt hook in the end. Here's what my zipper looked like when it was finished and in. Like so. Nobody analyze my zipper too closely, please. Alright, so that center of the waistband gets put to the side seam dart over there. It's not really a side seam anymore. On the right-hand side. And then I'll make sure this fits down into this area, pin it a couple of times, make sure everything's behaving and the darts are pinned down facing towards the center front, because that's how I have them pressed. And on my waistband, I have it measured like 15.25 inches from the center outwards, and my front is a little bit smaller and my back is a little bit bigger than that, so I just have to adjust for that while pinning this. But I just like leaving my waistbands a little bit long until I finish them, so have a few inches to spare on either side. Better to have a few extra inches of waistband at this point than not enough. And I like having my waistbands an inch wide, so that's why I cut them 3 inches. And then when everything gets folded in a 1/2 inch, it ends up being a 1-inch waistband. I'll take that over here to the machine, stitch that on. Again, 12 stitches per inch. Again, 1/2 inch seam allowance, as always. And again, I'll sew over these pins, no problem. You can see the selvage of this fabric. It's got yellow and mauve colored threads. So it's kind of like a mauvey brown and bright yellow cross like threads on this, and then, lengthwise threads on this, and then a black cross weave. So none of the colors of thread in this, that make up the weave of this fabric, are actually green. It's all just like an optical illusion of having mauve, yellow, and black close together. It creates this olive green color, which is why this fabric is just so iridescent and lovely, honestly. Again, this is a ribbed silk taffeta from Silk Baron, and you can see I'm just folding that pre-ironed 1/2 inch edge down along the inside to cover up that seam allowance. And here on the end, I will cut this. Well, I'll press it for a minute. And then I will cut this to create a little tab here hanging off the end that I can put a skirt hook onto later. Fold that in on itself, get it to behave. And then all of this I will hand stitch down to the inside again. Just fell this down invisibly from the outside, but nice and stitched shut on the inside. But I'll go all the way along here on this waistband, just pinning it in place like so. And then this other side is the underlapped side of the waistband, so I can, or of the zipper, so I can go ahead and make the waistband finish right at the edge, like so. And then it's time to hem this skirt, for which I'm going to use bias tape again. This time I cut it a little bit wider. So this is a 3-inch wide bias tape instead of a 2-inch wide, and I'm just pressing a 1/2 inch in on either side. You can see what my waistband looks like all finished up here. Hand stitched off camera, sorry about that. And then I'm going to slide this onto the ironing board so I can make sure that I'm like pressing like my fingers. You can see me smoothing this out. There's a tiny bit of an overlap there where things don't match up. But I just want to smooth this all out as best I can to make sure that the outer layer and the lining layer, the flat lined layer, are nice and smooth and nothing is bubbling out larger or like longer or shorter than the other layer. But then I can go ahead and pin on right sides together on the outside of my skirt, my large bias tape. I went with a wider bias tape on this just because I knew this circle cut area, because I wasn't hanging it before I hemmed it. I'm just hemming it the same day. You should probably let an area like this hang if you all want it to level out to the same level. It will stretch a little bit on the bias. But I don't care if it dips down asymmetric a little bit. And if it does, I want it to be silk colored. So I just wanted to use a little bit of a wider, almost like hem facing on this, so that if the layers end up like drooping down in this fold, which is fine stylistically, I just want them to also be green. So that's why I hemmed this with a little bit of wider bias tape. It does mean you have to kind of steam this into submission on the inside, which I'll show you in a minute, to have this wider tape on here, but you can use a regular width of bias tape. You can hem things however you like, but because this skirt has both a straight cut pencil skirt hem and this circle cut hem on the other side, so technically it is a curvy hem. We all know I like to hem curved areas with bias. It's just the easiest way to finish it, in my opinion, and it gives such a nice clean finish. It feels very satisfying, so I always prefer some bias like so. So here on the inside, I will curve this towards the inside, press that hem flat, like so, and then try and ease this, because like when you're hemming with bias is stretchy. It like compresses and expands that 45-degree angle cut of the fabric, so it can be the length I need on the wider edge of the hem, and then I can press it to kind of compress into the smaller circumference that the skirt is a couple inches up. Hopefully you see what I mean here when I'm saying that. So like where the bias tape, I'm pinning it to the inner lining here. I am just pinning this only to the inner lining, by the way, and I will stitch it down to the interlining, so none of the stitching for the hem will show on the outside. Always nice. But it's a little bit smaller, so I need to compress the bias down, and a little bit of steam and floofing it around with my fingers can kind of convince the silk to compress a little bit along the higher circumference of this circle flare, which is a little bit smaller, of course, than the bottom. It's a little mathy. Don't think about it too hard, you know? I don't know how or why radiuses and circumferences and circles and stuff. I just make clothes, you know? There's math happening that I never really know about. But just folding that up along the straight edges as well, and all the curves, pinning that to my interlining, pressing it into submission, and then I will sit and I will hand stitch all of this hem while listening to the Charger game through the wall. Not really. I was listening to some Westworld soundtrack here in my studio, but on the other side of the wall, down here in the basement, there was a football game happening. Which, that's the only bummer about fall, is that it's football season. But soon enough, next year hopefully, fingers crossed, I might be in my own house, where there will never be any NFL, to overhear, which is nice. I don't care about any sports ball. I'm not a sports human of any kind. You know, not my jam. Here on the other side, for some reason my bias tape was a little bit wider. I could have messed with this to make it match up perfectly, but I just didn't care enough because it's the inside of my skirt on the floopy area where it will not be seen. So whatever. I'm just going to finish this down so it's clean, even if it doesn't match up perfectly. I could have folded this extra or unfolded the other side, but whatever. And here to hem this, I'm just going to take a centimeter size stitch, almost a 1/2 inch. You know, if I were better about it, I would take 1/4 inch long stitches, but this works fine. Take a big long stitch into the inner lining and into the folded edge of the bias. Repeat all the way along the hem, like so. This is just double thread on a beading needle again. You know how I love my beetles. A lot of people love a short needle. I love a long needle, you know? Just goes to show that you can, either can work if it works better for you. Mantra of sewing there. There's many, many ways to do things. There are a few hard and fast rules, in my opinion. I would say the only hard sewing rules I have are pre-wash your fabric if it's washable, clip your curves, and you're gonna have to press. Those are my 3 rules. But I will go ahead and show you the finished silk skirt and also the orange polyester version as well. And here is my finished Mandragora silk taffeta skirt with this lovely side swoosh, little asymmetric drape here. I don't care again if this hem dips down a little bit. That's why I faced it with so much silk on the back so that it can floop around and be asymmetric and droopy, and I don't mind because that's sort of the whole idea of this skirt anyhow. And of course I can wear this with the mock-up batty backed jacket from last week, or maybe my velvet suit jacket from my vintage suiting closet, any of my vintage suit jackets I suppose, or any of my brocade wrap back tops and things that I make. Even the cotton sateen wrap back top might be dressed up by pairing it with this skirt. So I can actually see a lot of ways I could wear this skirt in the future, despite it being kind of ridiculously, fancy, being taffeta and all, but I'd wear it out and about during the day, to the antique mall while I walk around, hopefully not knocking into anything with the floop of the skirt, because I've been known to break a salad plate and end up with buying the set just walking around normally. So really I cannot be trusted around fragile things, but I'll do my best. I'll be back next week with the matching Mandragora silk taffeta jacket with a ton of embellishment, so if you've missed me beating it all, you'll be seeing a lot of that next week, and I will be recovering, or at least my arm/shoulder will be, from this project for a long time, because it ended up, let's just say for this jacket next week, I scheduled 2 days for it, and it took 8. So, things got a lot more involved than I originally thought. Thank you as always for watching today, and thank you to my patrons for making my projects possible. I'll be back here with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, and crafting real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye.